From the Chronicles of Z series, I'm going to read you the first book, 13 Days in Solem County, by Brian Speck. Chapter 1. Welcome to Solem County. Z sped along a long stretch of unfamiliar highway with the crisp night air burning into his skin. Spring had blossomed, and its temperate days had seduced him to venture further northward into the mountains. But after the sun had disappeared below the horizon, winter reasserted a frigid reminder of its icy grip. His riding gloves did little to shield his hands from the chill, and the feeling had left his face some time ago. The potholes along this ragged route would have proved a challenge for a fresh rider in the daylight. There were no yellow lines separating the lanes, or white lines along the sides of the asphalt. The road wound treacherously around the landscape as it climbed higher into the mountains. Nevertheless, despite the possibility of a gruesome mishap from his foolhardy persistence, Z refused to slow his pace. For 3 months now, before turning his bike north, he had roamed the regions of the West, revisiting the desolate destinations of yesteryear. After half a lifetime of mediocre employment, unsuccessful business ventures, and failed relationships, Z once again found himself displaced. As a younger man, such excursions were full of sensation and adventure. But as an older man, wandering no longer held the same appeal. Z now faced the sobering realization that everything he'd set his hand to had miscarried miserably. Tramping about the States used to seem fun. However, without his comrades, the burden of destitution at the end of a lifelong string of failures left Z saddled with a tremendous weight of self-pity and despair. He had scant hope of anything changing, and he didn't have anyone waiting for him back home. Everything about his life seemed a disaster, yet some small sliver of optimism urged Z ever onward, promising him that his place in the world still awaited. Z stood tall and lean. Although middle-aged, he continued to style his thick salt and pepper mane as if he belonged in a garage band. His skin displayed a modest amount of ink, but nothing too extreme. Nor did he have any tattoos on his face or neck, and no oversized piercings in uncomfortable places. Z wasn't having a midlife crisis. He had never fully departed from his youthful ways in the first place. He owned very little, but he was aware that he still looked good cruising the landscape on his motorcycle. Together for nearly 21 years now, Z's bike had remained a constant companion while his other relationships dissolved into oblivion around him, some slowly, others more abruptly. Z had adhered to his bike's routine maintenance schedule, and, as his finances allowed, he had upgraded this part or that until his decorated ride suited his fancy. Although it was an outdated model, his customized ride continued to be a fine specimen of reliable machinery. Any man could tell it was an object worthy of admiration and desire. However, preserving his human connections proved infinitely more challenging. Maybe too much time in front of the mirror had diminished his empathy for others. Maybe his mother had overindulged him too much as a child. Maybe his father drank too much. Whatever the cause, when sustaining his relations demanded more than good looks and smooth words, Z found his abilities lacking. An extra bouquet of roses couldn't fix the consequences of his every lapse of judgment. Apparently, Z was forever destined to cleave to speed and steel instead of flesh and blood. Tonight, a fog had settled inside his head. He hadn't intended to be on the road after nightfall, but sometimes driving aimlessly can leave you in an inconvenient place. He didn't have an actual destination, just north. He hadn't anticipated this much barren highway between stops, and he had already been on the road way too long. When the night wind began freezing his face, Z became desperate for a respite. It took all of his efforts to keep his heavy eyes focused. After seemingly endless miles of desolate thoroughfare, hope presented itself on his left. Ahead, he spied a solitary street lamp straining to light the parking lot of a dingy motel amid a tiny town. Relieved, Z pulled his overworn bike next to an antiquated blue pickup truck parked outside the office. With his feet finally planted on solid ground, Z stretched his limbs and took a quick glance around. The brick motel was unspectacular and in a state of disrepair. There were no other guests here tonight, only the pickup, which he assumed to be the manager's. There wasn't actually a sign anywhere that said motel, but the building seemed obvious. It had 4 rooms in a row. It had 2 snack machines between them and an office at the far right. Z could see a blocky building next to the motel and 2 more structures across the road, but he couldn't make out the details at night. Right now, he didn't care. His only concern was rest. Like the moths and crane flies tirelessly bumping their bodies against the glass, Z gravitated towards the meager neon vacancy sign glowing inside the office window. There, Z gently rapped until a frail, unkempt man with deep wrinkles and dark eyes raised the blinds and peered suspiciously at Z through the glass. After carefully assessing him, the man opened a small portal in the window, never taking his eyes off of Z. Though fatigued and feeling rough, Z attempted to be genial and start their meeting with some small talk. Giving a pleasant but not overly ambitious smile, he said, "Nice night, huh?" There was nothing remarkable about Z at a glance. His choice of clothing didn't entirely suit his age, but he wasn't offensive. Z wasn't extremely educated, but he was no dummy either. He did, however, possess 2 extraordinary abilities: his persistent coolness and an endearing personality. Although, the more he progressed through the years, the more Z's charisma seemed to fail him. Just like now, the attendant was unaffected by Z's subtle graces and maintained a stoic silence, leaving Z standing there like a moron waiting for a response. Eventually, Z stammered on, "Well, anyway, I need a room." Speaking no more than necessary, the man expedited Z's transaction and handed him the key to room number 3. "Thanks," Z said. Not giving up on winning over a friend just yet, Z started, "Have a good..." But the attendant pulled his face from the window and dropped the blinds. "Okay then," Z said to no one. After moving his bike to a parking spot in front of his room, he retrieved his essential items from his leather saddlebags and slid his room key into the latch. After giving the deadbolt a twist with one hand and the knob a turn with the other, Z still had to give the door a bump with his shoulder to unseat it from the frame. Upon opening the door, he lost a breath as the musty aroma of stale mildew and death rushed from the room and bombarded his nostrils. Even from standing outside, the place reeked as if a pack of poisoned rodents lay decomposing behind its walls. Z inched himself into the blackened room like someone testing the waters of a cold lake with their toes before wading in. Inside the doorway, a tangible filth permeated the air and engulfed Z with its substance as he eased onward, groping for a light switch. His fingers discovered one, and he flicked it on, illuminating a single low-wattage bulb hanging from the ceiling by bare wires. Its dim luminescence revealed a nasty niche, unattended, unkempt, and certainly unwelcoming. The walls, bed, and floor coverings were each different colors of mismatched hues from decades past. Along the edges, Matted shag carpet collected the particles of crispy wallpaper that had flecked from the walls. Z had rested his head at some less than perfect cubby holes in his lifetime, but this had to be the worst of them all, if for no other reason than the stench. Who could tell what foul festivities and furtive fornications had sloughed off their fragrances within these walls prior to his arrival? Usually businesses strive to appeal to their patrons, but it was as if this place sought to expel them immediately. Despite the putrid atmosphere, Z's circumstances offered no other choice than this horrid hole. Tonight, this was home. Propping the front door while he settled in, Z wasted no time preparing for rest. Eager to wash the sweat and road grime away, he entered the tiny bathroom and turned the knobs in the discolored bathtub. The pipes howled and complained as they forced a rusty trickle from the shower head. The water worked well enough to shower and shave, but he dared not swallow any after brushing his teeth. Afterwards, Z reluctantly closed the outside door. In need of some serious shut-eye, he settled on top of the covers, unwilling to risk wrapping himself within the spotted sheets. There, although clean and exhausted, sleep still eluded him. His troubled mind pondered his situation. He carried no extra food or water with him, and he had only a few days' worth of vape juice for his mod. Cash was running low. Plus, there was the uncomfortable pollution of the diseased room. Giving up on getting any sleep, he sat atop the bed and spread out the contents of his bundle to take an inventory. Beholding all of his earthly possessions, Z assessed their worth. His extra clothing and toiletries were of no use to anyone else, nor was his small fixed-blade knife, his cell phone, or his vaping module. The only items of value were 2 wedding bands, 1 engagement ring, and a .44 Magnum revolver. So far, he had been unwilling to part with the rings, no matter how sparse his finances, although reuniting with their previous wearer remained unlikely. The pistol had belonged to Z's father, and it was all that Z possessed of his father's earthly belongings for an inheritance. Though heavy in the hands of someone who tried to travel light, this too was a trinket worth keeping. Z carried no extra ammo, but he kept it fully loaded with a live round in all 6 chambers. Leaving the pistol on the bed, he returned the other items to his pack. With his eyes again growing weary, Z settled on the television's least static-filled channel and leaned against the headboard with the flat feather pillow behind him. There, he carelessly fondled the firearm until he fell asleep. Early the next morning, intense hunger awakened Z. The previous night, sheer exhaustion had overshadowed his senses and diminished his perceptions. But now, the need for food was urgent. Before arriving here, his diet had been irregular, with Z surviving on fast food and processed snacks from convenience stores. He'd missed many meals on long stretches of highway. Dragging himself from the bed, Z tended to his hygiene, gathered his composure, and collected his things. When he opened the door, intense sunlight and fresh air flooded in, and it reminded Z that freedom and goodness still exist in the world. Only in time for Z to behold a new travesty: a flat tire on the rear wheel of his bike. After a single night in the abhorrent room, Z knew this was the last place on earth he would want to be stranded, but with his ride crippled, he couldn't go anywhere. With his senses rekindling, Z wondered, where am I anyway? The entire town consisted of only 4 buildings. It was planted like an oasis in the middle of an insurmountable wooded wasteland. The thick forest climbed a mountainside behind the motel, and in the opposite direction descended into a steep valley. Wandering about the parking lot, looking for some clue to his whereabouts, Z found the town devoid of life. Even the pickup from the night before was now absent. Directly across the street, next to another brick building, sat an equally antiquated sheriff car. It looked like it hadn't moved in years. But then again, so had the attendant's truck. Maybe its steward could offer some assistance. But before Z set out across the roadway, the agony in his empty stomach prompted him to pay the vending area a quick visit first. He decided to despair over the disaster of his tire after securing something to eat. Being on the road had taught Z to stay equipped with plenty of loose change for such occasions. After feeding coins into the drink machine and pressing the button, it spat out his favorite beverage. Immediately, Z cracked the seal and sucked down the greenish, sugary syrup without taking a breath. Oh, the bliss of sweet nectar in the morning. He straightway bought a second can. Over the years, despite experimenting with a variety of pharmaceuticals and other mind-altering substances, Z had avoided adopting any particular habits other than nicotine and an affinity for soft drinks. Unchecked, he would drink one soda after the other and seldom drank anything else unless it included alcohol. Z considered himself to be a survivalist as well as a minimalist, yet he always preferred his carbonated delights in a large container filled to the brim with shaved ice. But here, he had no such luxury. Straight from the can would have to do. Shifting his attention to the snack machine, he spied several suitable edibles. Ranging from crackers to chips to peanuts and even a few pastries, its contents beckoned to him from behind the clean, clear glass. Though not as desirable as a hot meal, Z anticipated the carbohydrates, salts, and sugars that awaited him only inches and seconds away. Unwilling to spend the time it would take to count quarters, he attempted to insert a smoothed-out dollar bill. Unresponsive, no matter the angle and how much Z flattened the note, or the language he used, the machine taunted him and withheld its services. Z resorted to his change. The coins slid into the chute without effort, but whatever mechanisms which were supposed to register his currency did not function. The money slid down to disappear into the oblivion of some unseen reservoir with a gentle plink, but none of the buttons on the machine would deliver him a snack. The coin return lever was equally unresponsive. $3.75 later, fury stirred within Z. The bandit before him was bolted steadfast to the concrete, and shaking it proved impossible. Shouting and pounding on the glass was unhelpful as well. There was a small pile of bricks stacked against the wall. But before succumbing to rage and redirecting the purpose of one of these, Z conceded that cooler heads must prevail. Taking solace in having at least a functional drink machine, Z used the rest of his change to purchase a third soda. He set the can on his motorcycle and walked over to the motel office to make sure that no one was there. After knocking on the door and the window with no answer, he noticed that the vacancy light was off, even though no other vehicles had arrived during the night. Z wondered if the other apartments were as foul as his. He stared across the street to see if the old sheriff car had an owner. On arriving there, the front of the building, the printing said on a large window, Solem County City Hall. The words meant little to Z. He had never heard of Solem County, but at least now this place had a name. There were business hours posted on the door, but it was locked and there were no people in sight. The area outside was clean and tidy, but peering through the window, Z could see an incredible filth of papers and clutter covering all of the surfaces inside. It looked as if no one had attended this establishment in years. It seemed as if the motel attendant might be the only remaining living soul in this forgotten place. The lot across the gravel from the city hall held a rundown gas station that appeared to have been erected around the same time as the advent of the automobile. Underneath the awning, a full-service sign hung above a single antique gas pump. The last time anyone changed the prices, gas cost 30 cents a gallon. That evidence, along with the smoky windows in the office garage, gave the impression that the station had been closed for several generations. Z didn't think he would find anything helpful there, but with nothing better to do and no one to deter him, he decided to take a look anyway. As he passed, he took a moment to examine the abandoned sheriff car. The decals were peeling, but he could make out Solem County Sheriff printed on the driver's side door. Spotted with rust, its paint bleached by sunlight, and the tires deflated and dry-rotted, the automobile had given up service years ago, possibly at the same time the gas station closed. Casually gazing into the vehicle, Z noticed it housed as much mess as the nearby office. But as he walked past, Z spied something of interest inside the front windshield. There, perched on the fractured dash, just inside a half-open passenger window, sat an unopened pack of peanut butter cheese crackers. The same type of crackers he had unsuccessfully attempted to purchase from the uncooperative snack machine. Z scanned the building beside him. He studied the high branches in the tree line behind the hall. He looked at the top of the street lamp across the road. He didn't discover any surveillance equipment, and he already knew there were no people about. Now, Z was not a thief by trade, and was a mostly lawful citizen, but an insignificant petty theft did not lie outside his realm of consideration. He thought hard about taking the crackers. Goodness knows he wanted them. But how does a crafty rat know when to leave a piece of cheese on a trap? Or how does a fish know when to ignore a worm on a hook? Did the precise placement of the package seem somehow too purposeful? Did the position, just within reach inside a conveniently open window, seem unnatural and obvious? Though his hunger was becoming unbearable, Z sensed that he should not succumb to this temptation, and he left the crackers delicately balanced on their precipice. Moving on, he approached the gas station, where, as expected, the business appeared to have been closed for decades. Inside the cloudy windows, an inch of dusty grease covered the tools, the shelves, and the car parts entombed within this automotive mausoleum. When Z pulled his face from the window, ready to check out the last building back across the road, he noticed something that he had missed earlier. On the fuel pump, a shiny new padlock secured the nozzle to the housing. The pump itself appeared to date back to 1930-something. To Z, it seemed implausible that the pump had been operational within the last 50 years, so why, in recent times, would someone feel the need to lock up a depleted reserve? It was unlikely anyone would worry over someone stealing an outdated pump handle. Z pondered this curiosity as he made his way back across the road towards the last unexplored structure in the town. In the window of the building next to the motel, it read, "Glass Repair Shop." There was a small office behind decorative wrought iron bars covering the front window and door. On the sides of the building, the windows were blackened out and guarded by raw rebar, which made peeping into these to see the back room impossible. Z wondered, why, in a place with only 4 buildings, would it be so important to have a glass repair shop? It appeared an unlikely choice of essential establishments in such a small town. Naturally curious, and with nothing better to do, Z walked around to the back of the building. The back entrance was secured by a large metal door. It was big enough to allow a vehicle to pull into the shop. It had 4 small windows in a row. They too were blacked out, but one of these windows had a small fracture and a chip missing just large enough for Z to peer inside. He couldn't see much through the tiny hole, but he could make out frames holding glass sheets along one wall and a table covered in carpet with a few hand tools on it next to them. In the middle of the room, however, sat a large rack with an oversized lever on its side. It was hard to see the details in the dark, but it appeared to have a pair of shackles at either end. Z didn't know much about glass repair, but he couldn't fathom how this contraption could have anything to do with that matter. Finding more questions and no answers, Z headed back to his bike. Whatever strange secrets this town hid, Z didn't care anymore. He only wanted to find something to eat and be on his way. He leaned against his motorcycle and took a long pull on his module. After holding the mist, he savored the vanilla and caramel smoke on his long exhale and had another sip of his drink. With no way to leave, and with no one to help, Z was undoubtedly stranded. Accepting his predicament, he found propping against the side of the motel more comfortable than sitting on his bike in the direct sunlight. There, Z sat for hours, hoping for a change. At length, he heard a vehicle approaching from the highway opposite the route he had entered the town. From afar, the engine heralded its approach with a loud, clamorous noise. The motor sounded as if someone ran the machine at full throttle with an ineffective muffler installed. Its overture lasted much longer than expected as the sound grew closer. Eventually, the raggedy blue pickup from the night before pulled back into its spot in front of the office. The attendant had returned.